Story 1. If I could go back, I definitely warn myself about giving everything to someone who's barely invested. I was head over heels for this girl back in college. She was charming, funny, and gorgeous. I did everything for her. Cooked meals, bought her thoughtful gifts, even drove out of my way to pick her up after work, just because I wanted to see her smile. But the signs were there. She rarely called first, almost never asked how I was doing, and canceled plans at the last minute without a second thought. One night, I waited outside her apartment in the rain to give her a ride home. She came out, barely noticed I was soaked, didn't thank me, and the moment she got in the car, she was glued to her phone, laughing at texts from someone else. Looking back, I realized I was way more in love with the idea of being with her than the reality of our relationship. Sometimes it takes stepping back to realize someone's only meeting you halfway, or even less. Edit. To everyone asking no, I didn't call her out on it then. I just drove her home and tried to ignore the feeling in my gut. It took me way too long to realize I deserved better. Story 2. If I could go back, I'd tell myself to keep a little mystery in relationships. I once dated this girl who was great, but I shared way too much too fast. From day one, I was an open book. Every fear, every embarrassing story, every mistake I'd ever made. She knew it all within weeks. I thought honesty would bring us closer, but instead, it made things awkward. I started to feel like I'd lost a bit of my own privacy, and there wasn't much left to discover about each other. After a while, she didn't seem as interested, and things fizzled out. In hindsight, I think the mystery is part of what keeps a relationship exciting. I learned that sharing everything right away isn't always the best route. Edit. For anyone curious, we stayed friends for a while, but it wasn't the same. We just knew too much, and there wasn't that spark to keep it alive. Story 3. There was this one time I wish I could go back and give myself a reality check. I started dating a girl who seemed perfect. She was funny, adventurous, and so affectionate. I couldn't believe my luck. But about 6 months in, little things started adding up. She'd get overly upset if I hung out with friends, check my messages, and even accuse me of flirting with my co-workers. I thought it was just a phase, so I brushed it off. Fast forward another year, and her jealousy was at a whole new level. One day she showed up at my job, accusing me of things I hadn't even done, all because she saw me smiling at a co-worker. I ended up breaking it off, but if I could go back, I'd tell myself to pay attention to those early red flags. Edit. To those asking why I didn't notice it sooner, I think I just liked her too much and wanted to see the best. Sometimes we're our own worst blind spots. Story 4. If I could go back, I'd definitely tell myself to be upfront about my needs in relationships. I was dating this guy who I was crazy about, but I always felt like a second priority. He was constantly busy with work, friends, or some new hobby, and our plans were always getting pushed aside. I kept quiet because I didn't want to be that person, clingy or demanding. Eventually, I felt drained from being the only one putting in effort. When I finally brought it up, he was surprised I'd even felt that way, and it was clear he didn't see us going anywhere serious. I'd invested so much time without ever really speaking up. Looking back, I wish I'd been honest with myself and him from the start. Edit. A lot of people have asked if he changed afterward. He didn't, and honestly, it helped me understand that we were just on different pages all along. Story 5. If I could rewind, I'd tell myself that some things aren't worth holding on to. My high school girlfriend and I were inseparable, but we were constantly fighting. Every time we argued, we'd break up for a few days, then get back together, thinking we could make it work. Our friends and families would roll their eyes because they knew how toxic it was, but we ignored everyone. I thought it was passionate or something. It wasn't until we'd gone through the same cycle about 10 times that I finally realized it wasn't healthy. Looking back, I wish I'd seen that real love doesn't feel like a roller coaster. I learned that peace and stability are worth a lot more than passion that comes with constant drama. Edit. Funny enough, I bumped into her years later, and she told me she felt the same way. Just stuck in a loop we didn't know how to get out of. Story 6. There was one relationship that really taught me to set boundaries. I met this guy at a concert and we hit it off right away. Things moved fast, almost too fast. Within weeks, he was practically living at my place, calling me non-stop, and getting annoyed if I didn't text back immediately. At first, I thought it was just him being sweet, but it became suffocating. I was losing touch with my friends, spending all my time with him, and feeling constantly on edge. Eventually, I realized I'd let go of way too much of myself. I broke things off, but it was a lesson in not letting someone take over my entire life, no matter how strong the attraction. Edit. For everyone wondering, he tried to get back in touch a few times, but I had to cut off contact completely. Sometimes no contact really is the best path. Story 7. If I could talk to my younger self, I'd tell him not to ignore his own needs, just to make a relationship work. I dated this girl who was the complete opposite of me. She was super social and outgoing, and I was more of an introvert. We'd go out every weekend, meet up with her friends, and do things that totally drained me. I kept doing it because I didn't want to disappoint her or seem like a killjoy. Eventually, it hit me that I'd been ignoring my own happiness just to keep her satisfied. It wasn't her fault, but we just weren't compatible. I learned that being with someone who respects your needs is essential. Edit. In case anyone's curious, we ended on good terms. She's still super social, and I realized I needed someone who balances my energy better. Story 8. Back in my early 20s, I was so caught up in being the perfect boyfriend that I forgot to actually be myself. I thought I had to match this ideal version she had in her mind. Buy flowers, remember every little thing, always say the right words. It was exhausting, and honestly, I lost track of what I wanted because I was so focused on making her happy. I was so busy being perfect that I stopped enjoying the relationship. After we broke up, I realized I had no idea what I even liked to do on my own. It took me a while to find myself again, but I'd tell anyone now, don't be who you think someone wants. Just be yourself and find someone who loves that. Edit. And no, she wasn't mean or demanding. I just got caught up in my own expectations of what I should be as a boyfriend. Story 9. If I could go back, I'd remind myself that it's okay to ask for clarity in relationships. I dated this guy for almost 2 years, but he never wanted to put a label on it. Every time I'd bring it up, he'd brush it off, saying, "Why do we need to label things?" I stuck around, hoping he'd come around, but eventually I realized I was just getting strung along. Looking back, I should have respected my own needs and walked away sooner. Relationships should be clear, not confusing. If someone's making you guess, they probably aren't as invested as you are. Edit. For everyone asking, no, I don't think he was seeing other people. He just liked having me around without any commitment. Story 10. I wish I could tell my younger self that trying to fix someone isn't love. I was in a relationship with a guy who was dealing with a lot. Family issues, job stress, even depression. I cared about him so much that I took on the role of his personal therapist, always trying to cheer him up, make his life easier, and carry the weight of his struggles. It felt noble at the time, but it was slowly wearing me down. Eventually, I realized that no matter how much I loved him, he needed to work through his own issues. It wasn't my job to save him. Sometimes love means supporting someone from a distance so they can find their own strength. Edit. Yes, he's doing okay now. We're not together, but I hope he got the help he needed. Story 11. I'd go back and tell myself not to get so caught up in someone else's dreams that I forget my own. I was dating this girl who had her whole life planned out. Career, dream city, even the house she wanted. I was so in love with her that I went along with it, thinking I'd make it all work. I ended up changing my major, moving across the country, and taking a job I wasn't even excited about, all because I wanted to fit into her vision of the future. After a few years, we broke up, and I had to start from scratch. I lost touch with my own goals and what I truly wanted out of life. Love is amazing, but don't sacrifice everything you are for someone else. In a good relationship, you grow together, not one person growing while the other shrinks. Edit. To everyone asking, we haven't talked in years, but I still think about those choices sometimes. It was a hard lesson. Story 12. I wish I could tell my younger self not to ignore little things that bother you early on. I was dating this girl who would constantly criticize small things. How I dressed, how I ate, even how I laughed. I thought she was just being playful, and I'd laugh it off. But over time, it chipped away at my confidence. I started to second-guess myself, and felt like nothing I did was good enough. It wasn't until a friend pointed it out that I realized it was a form of control. She was trying to change me into someone else, someone that fit her idea of a perfect partner. I left, and it took time to rebuild my self-esteem. Now, I tell anyone, if someone's making you feel small, it's not love. Walk away. Edit. And no, I don't think she meant to be malicious. It just wasn't healthy for either of us. Story 13. There was a time I was so focused on avoiding arguments that I never actually voiced my opinions. I was dating this girl who didn't take criticism well, so I learned to keep quiet whenever I was upset or disagreed. It seemed harmless at first, like, hey, it's just a minor thing. No need to make it a big deal. But over time, these little things built up into this mountain of unspoken issues. Eventually, I realized I'd been bottling things up to the point where I barely recognized myself. I ended up snapping over something small, and the relationship fell apart. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that open communication isn't just a nice to have in relationships. It's everything. Edit. To anyone wondering, I did learn from it. I'm in a much healthier relationship now where we actually talk things through. Story 14. If I could go back, I'd tell myself not to overlook the importance of independence. I dated this guy who wanted us to do everything together. Weekends, dinners, even hobbies. It seemed romantic, and I loved spending time with him. But I started losing my individuality. I stopped doing the things I enjoyed alone and spent less time with friends and family, just because he'd rather we always be together. It was only after we broke up that I realized how much I'd given up. Relationships are great, but they shouldn't take away from who you are as a person. Now I know it's healthy to have time apart and maintain your own interests. Edit. For everyone curious, we're both doing fine and found our own paths. Story 15. I'd go back and tell myself not to rush into serious commitments just because everyone else seems to be doing it. In my early 20s, I felt this pressure to settle down, so when I met a girl who was ready for all that, I jumped in without thinking twice. We got engaged, talked about buying a house, the whole 9 yards. But as time went on, I realized we barely had anything in common. I was more focused on keeping up than on whether we were actually a good match. The breakup was messy, and I had to take a hard look at why I felt so rushed. If I could do it over, I'd remind myself that love isn't a race, and there's no deadline. Taking time to find the right person is worth way more than a fast track to regret. Edit. And yes, I'm still single and focusing on myself, which feels pretty great. Story 16. If I could go back, I'd tell myself not to ignore my own gut feelings. I was dating this girl who had a lot of past relationship baggage, but I thought I could help her work through it. Every time something seemed off, like her constantly bringing up her exes or blaming me for things I didn't even do, I'd tell myself to be patient. I figured love meant supporting her no matter what. It took me a long time to realize that some things were beyond my control. No matter how much I tried, I couldn't fix the hurt she carried. Now I know that it's okay to step away when a relationship isn't healthy. Love doesn't mean sacrificing your peace of mind. Edit. For everyone asking, yes, she did find help and seems to be doing better now. Sometimes you just aren't the right person to fix things for someone. Story 17. If I could go back, I'd tell myself not to confuse being needed with being loved. I dated this guy who was struggling, lost his job, had family issues, the works. I thought being there for him through it all would make us closer. I was always ready to help, always the first call when something went wrong. But eventually, it became clear that he wasn't with me because he loved me. He was with me because he needed a safety net. After we broke up, he moved on quickly, and I was left feeling used. Love isn't about being someone's crutch. It's about being equals. Looking back, I wish I'd seen the difference sooner. Edit. And no, I don't regret being kind to him. I just wish I'd been kinder to myself, too. Story 18. There was a time I thought compromise meant giving up everything I wanted. I dated this girl who had strong opinions about, well, everything. I thought that by letting her choose, I was showing I cared. I went along with her plans, from big things like moving to a new city to small stuff like where we'd eat. But over time, I started to feel resentful, like I didn't have a voice in our relationship. I finally realized that compromise doesn't mean one person giving up everything to make the other happy. It has to be a balance. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that my happiness matters just as much. Edit. No, I don't blame her. It was a learning curve for both of us. Story 19. I'd tell my younger self to stop trying to make everything perfect. I was in this relationship where I felt like I had to be this ideal boyfriend, always planning cute dates, surprising her with gifts, and putting her happiness above everything else. I thought I had to constantly prove my love, or she'd lose interest. But I started feeling burnt out, and it was like I was walking on eggshells, worried I wasn't doing enough. In the end, it turned out she didn't even want all those things. She just wanted me to be myself. Looking back, I remind myself that real love doesn't need grand gestures every day. Sometimes, just being together is enough. Edit. Funny thing, we're still friends. She told me later that she felt overwhelmed by all the effort I was putting in. Story 20. If I could go back, I'd remind myself that trust is everything. I was dating this girl who had a habit of lying. Little things at first, like who she was hanging out with or what she did over the weekend. I brushed it off, telling myself they were just white lies. But eventually, it spiraled into bigger things. I found myself constantly anxious, wondering if she was telling the truth. Eventually, I couldn't ignore it anymore, and the relationship ended on a sour note. Now, I'd tell myself that if there's no trust, there's no relationship. No one deserves to live with that kind of doubt. Edit. And no, we never really talked again after that. But it was a lesson I needed to learn. Story 21. If I could go back, I'd tell myself to look at how someone treats others, not just how they treat me. I dated this girl who was always super sweet to me, but she was rude to waitstaff, complained constantly about her friends, and didn't have a good word to say about her family. I brushed it off, thinking maybe she just needed to vent, or that she acted differently when it mattered. I even felt special because she was kind to me. Over time, though, I started seeing that this was just who she was, complaining and tearing people down. Eventually, it started to spill over onto me too, and I realized that I was dating someone who just didn't have much respect for others. Now, I tell myself to look at how someone treats everyone, not just how they treat me in the honeymoon phase. Edit. I know some people think this is obvious, but back then, I thought I was the exception. Spoiler, I wasn't. Story 22. I'd go back and tell myself to take things slowly, instead of rushing into every new relationship like it was the one. I was a hopeless romantic and believed every person I dated was my soulmate. Every relationship was intense, full of promises, and everything happened way too fast. In my head, I'd already imagined the wedding and kids by the third date. But of course, things fell apart just as quickly as they began. It took a few heartbreaks to realize that building something real takes time. You can't skip the part where you actually get to know each other. I'd tell my younger self that true love isn't about intensity, it's about stability. Edit. To anyone who's been there, you know that it's exhausting to be on that constant emotional roller coaster. Story 23. There was a time I thought I could ignore major differences because love conquers all, right? Wrong. I dated this guy who had completely different values from me. Religion, politics, even life goals. I convinced myself that our love was strong enough to bridge any gap, and I ignored all the awkward conversations and disagreements. We kept pushing through, even though our relationship was basically one long debate. Eventually, we hit a point where it was clear neither of us was going to change. It was exhausting, and neither of us was happy. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that love alone isn't always enough. Shared values matter more than I thought. Edit. Yeah, we're both with people now who are way better matches. Lesson learned. Story 24. I wish I'd learned sooner that love isn't about being someone's therapist. When I started dating my ex, he was going through a lot. A difficult job, unresolved family issues, and stress that seemed to follow him everywhere. I genuinely cared for him and wanted to be there for him through everything. Every evening turned into long conversations where he'd vent and express his fears, anxieties, and doubts. I'd sit with him, listen, reassure, and try to make him see things would eventually get better. I thought that by being this constant source of support, I could somehow fix everything for him, and that my love would be enough to carry us both through. But as time went on, I started feeling drained. I was so invested in his struggles that I lost sight of my own needs, my own well-being. I became exhausted and felt like I had nothing left to give, even though he always seemed to need more. Looking back, I'd tell my younger self that while it's wonderful to be supportive, there's a limit to how much one person can carry for another. Some issues go beyond what love can fix, and sometimes people need professional help that you simply can't provide. Supporting someone is one thing, but it's not your job to be their personal counselor or therapist. Edit. For everyone asking, yes, he did eventually seek help. It was a long journey, but he's doing better now. I truly hope he's found peace and happiness, and I'm glad he got the help he needed. Story 25. If I could go back, I'd remind myself that compromise shouldn't mean losing yourself. I was dating this girl who was very particular. She wanted things her way all the time, from where we ate to how we spent weekends. At first, I thought I was just being a good boyfriend by going along with it. But over time, I started to feel like I had no say in my own life. After we broke up, I realized I'd been ignoring my own wants and needs to keep the peace. Now, I know that compromise is important, but it should go both ways. Relationships should be about balance, not one person always bending. Edit. And to everyone who's been there, trust me, it feels amazing to finally stand up for yourself. Story 26. Looking back, I tell myself not to ignore financial red flags. I dated someone who was constantly in debt, always borrowing money, and rarely paying it back. I thought I could help her get her finances in order, so I started covering her bills, buying her groceries, even helping her pay off credit cards. But it was like pouring water into a bucket with holes. In the end, I realized I was just enabling her habits. Love isn't about being someone's bank, and if someone isn't financially responsible, it can put a huge strain on a relationship. I'd remind my younger self that financial stability really does matter. Edit. For those asking, no, I didn't get my money back. Hard lesson learned. Story 27. There was a time I thought jealousy was cute, like, if someone's a little possessive, it just means they care, right? So when I started dating this girl who was constantly checking my phone, asking about my female friends, and wanting to know where I was 24/7, I thought it was endearing. I ignored how it made me feel smothered, because I figured it was a sign of her devotion. Turns out, that kind of jealousy is a red flag, not a romantic gesture. It got so intense that I started lying just to avoid her questions, and we eventually broke up because I couldn't take it anymore. Now I tell myself that real love is about trust, not control. Edit. And yes, she kept tabs on me for a while after the breakup. It was a mess. Story 28. I used to think grand gestures were what made the relationship special. I'd plan elaborate dates, surprise getaways, and I was always trying to wow my girlfriends. But in the end, it was like I was trying to buy their affection or prove my worth through big events. I didn't realize that the everyday stuff mattered way more than any grand gesture. Now, I tell myself that love isn't about how big you can make a moment. It's about consistency. It's the little things, the small daily acts of care that make a relationship last. Edit. Ironically, one of those exes told me later that all she really wanted was for me to just listen more. Story 29. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that if someone isn't over their ex, there's nothing you can do to change that. I dated a guy who'd recently come out of a long relationship, and he'd still bring her up all the time. I thought I could help him move on, that I'd be the one, who'd make him forget about her. But no matter what I did, she was always in the back of his mind. Eventually, I realized I was competing with a memory, and it was unfair to both of us. If I could do it over, I'd give him the space to heal before trying to jump into something serious. Edit. And no, I didn't confront him about it. I just quietly slipped out of his life. It was better for us both. Story 30. I tell myself that sometimes, no matter how hard you try, a relationship just isn't going to work. I was dating this girl who was wonderful in so many ways, but we just didn't connect on a deeper level. I kept trying to make things work because I felt guilty about leaving someone who hadn't done anything wrong. I thought if I just tried harder, maybe we'd find that spark. After a while, I realized that not every relationship is meant to last forever, and that's okay. Breaking up doesn't mean you failed. It just means you're giving both of you a chance to find a better match. Edit. To everyone asking, we're still friends, and she found someone who's a much better fit for her. Story 31. If I could go back, I'd tell myself not to ignore red flags just because everything else seems perfect. I once dated this guy who was charming, successful, and treated me well. But there were little things. He'd make sarcastic jokes that bordered on mean, and he'd sometimes go silent if he didn't get his way. I'd brush it off, thinking nobody's perfect. Fast forward a few months, and those little things turned into big arguments. I realized I'd been so dazzled by the good stuff that I overlooked things that actually mattered. Now, I tell myself to pay attention to how someone makes you feel, not just how good they look on paper. Story 32. I'd tell my younger self to be honest about what I want from the start. I dated this girl who was super independent and made it clear she wasn't looking for anything serious. But I kept hoping that over time, she'd change her mind and we'd end up together long term. I pretended to be fine with her not wanting commitment, even though I wanted more. In the end, she moved on, and I was left feeling like I'd wasted my time. If I could go back, I'd tell myself to be honest about my intentions. It's better to find out if you're compatible from the start than to hope someone will change. Story 33. Looking back, I'd tell myself not to ignore the friends and family who had doubts. I was in a relationship where everyone around me saw issues that I couldn't or didn't want to see. They pointed out how controlling she was, how she seemed to manipulate situations, but I brushed it off as them not understanding her like I did. Eventually, those issues became impossible to ignore, and the relationship fell apart. Now I realize that sometimes the people who care about us can see things we're too close to notice. It's worth listening to them, even if it's hard. Edit. And no, they didn't say, "I told you so," but I could see it in their faces. Lesson learned. Story 34. If I could go back, I'd remind myself that compatibility isn't just about shared interests. I dated a girl who was into all the same things I was. Music, movies, even our favorite restaurants matched up. But when it came to deeper things, like values and future goals, we were completely different. I kept thinking our shared interest would be enough to make it work. Eventually, I realized that having things in common isn't the same as being truly compatible. Love goes beyond surface-level stuff, and you need a foundation to build on. I wish I'd figured that out sooner. Story 35. I wish I could go back and tell myself to be more aware of emotional manipulation. My ex had this way of turning everything around on me. If I brought up an issue, he'd make me feel guilty for bringing it up. If I needed space, he'd make it sound like I was abandoning him. I spent so much time questioning myself, wondering if I was in the wrong. After we broke up, I realized that he'd been manipulating me the whole time, and I hadn't even noticed. Now, I know to look out for those signs and to trust my own feelings more. Edit. A few people asked if I called him out. I didn't at the time, but I wish I had. It's hard to see clearly when you're in it. Story 36. There was a time I thought being in love meant never saying no. I dated this girl who had a very my way or the highway attitude, and I went along with it, thinking that's what love meant, always putting her happiness first. I'd skip out on my own plans, go to events I didn't enjoy, and basically molded myself to fit her world. Eventually, I realized I was losing myself just to make her happy. Love shouldn't feel like you're disappearing. If I could go back, I'd remind myself that saying no doesn't mean you don't care. It just means you value yourself too. Story 37. If I could go back, I'd tell myself not to ignore the way someone treats their own family. I dated this guy who had a rocky relationship with his parents, and he often talked down about them. I figured it was just family drama, and I didn't think it would impact us. But over time, I noticed he'd bring that same negativity into our relationship, constantly nitpicking and arguing. It taught me that how someone treats their family can be a big indicator of how they'll treat you. If they don't respect the people closest to them, that attitude can spill over. Edit. To everyone asking, we did eventually talk about it, but it didn't change much. People's family dynamics are hard to shift. Story 38. I'd go back and tell myself to watch out for people who can't handle being alone. I dated this girl who had a habit of jumping from one relationship to the next. She was never single for long, and I figured that just meant she was in demand. But after a while, I realized she wasn't really in love with me. She just couldn't stand being alone. Being someone's comfort blanket isn't the same as being loved. If I could do it over, I'd recognize that some people are looking for stability, not a real connection. You have to be okay on your own before you can be with someone else. Story 39. If I could give my younger self advice, I'd tell him not to be so quick to apologize. I dated someone who'd blame me for everything, even things that had nothing to do with me. If she was late, somehow it was my fault. If she had a bad day, I was supposed to fix it. I got so used to saying sorry that I stopped questioning if I was even in the wrong. Looking back, I realized that a healthy relationship doesn't involve one person always taking the blame. I wish I'd known it was okay to stand up for myself. Edit. And yes, it's a hard habit to break, but I've gotten better at not saying sorry when it's unnecessary. Story 40. If I could go back, I'd remind myself that loyalty doesn't mean putting up with disrespect. I dated this guy who was constantly putting me down in front of his friends. He'd make jokes at my expense, say I was too sensitive if I didn't laugh, and generally act like he was above me. I thought that by staying loyal, I was proving my love, but all it did was make me feel small. Now, I know that true loyalty is mutual. You shouldn't have to accept disrespect just to keep someone in your life. Edit. To anyone who's been through this, know that it's okay to walk away. Respect should never be optional. Story 41. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that not every fight is worth fixing. I dated someone who made every disagreement into a huge deal. I'd constantly find myself trying to calm things down, apologizing, and finding solutions, even when the issue wasn't really that serious. It was exhausting, but I thought that's what it took to make a relationship work. Looking back, I wish I'd known that love shouldn't feel like constant damage control. Some issues just aren't meant to be fixed, especially if they keep coming up. Now I know that sometimes walking away is healthier than sticking around. Story 42. I tell my younger self to listen to my own instincts instead of ignoring them. I once dated this guy who was nice enough, but there was always this small voice in the back of my mind saying something wasn't quite right. He was distant, avoided introducing me to his friends, and always had an excuse for why he couldn't spend time together. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I was just overthinking things. Turns out, he'd been seeing someone else the entire time. Now I know that if something feels off, it probably is. Trust your gut. It's there for a reason. Story 43. If I could go back, I'd tell myself not to get stuck in a relationship out of comfort. I was with this girl for years, and while we got along fine, there was no spark, no excitement. We'd spend our days doing the same things, saying the same things. I stayed because it was familiar and easy, but in the end, it felt like we were more roommates than partners. Now, I know that staying with someone just because it's comfortable isn't fair to either person. Sometimes, moving on is the best thing you can do for both of you. Edit. To everyone wondering, yes, we both ended up much happier apart. Comfort isn't always the answer. Story 44. I'd remind myself that love shouldn't be about trying to fix someone's life. I was dating this girl who had a lot on her plate. Family issues, job stress, and personal struggles that seemed to follow her everywhere. I cared about her deeply, and I thought that if I just loved her enough, if I showed her that she could lean on me, I'd be able to help her through everything. I became her emotional anchor. Anytime something went wrong, I'd be there, listening, reassuring, trying to make things right. I convinced myself that being her constant support was what love was all about. But as time went on, I started to feel the weight of it all. Every conversation seemed to revolve around her challenges, and I found myself putting aside my own needs to be there for her. I was exhausted, feeling more like her therapist than her boyfriend. Eventually, I realized that while supporting someone you care about is a big part of a relationship, it's also important to recognize your limits. I learned that sometimes people need to work through their struggles on their own to really grow and heal. Now, I appreciate relationships where there's mutual support, where we're both strong for each other, not just one person carrying all the weight. Real love, I've come to see, means walking beside someone, not carrying them. That balance makes all the difference. Story 45. If I could give myself advice, I'd say don't fall for potential. Fall for who they are now. I dated a guy who wasn't quite what I wanted, but I saw all this potential in him. I'd think, he'll change over time, or, once he achieves this, he'll be perfect. I kept convincing myself that he'd grow into the person I imagined, but he didn't. He was exactly who he was from day one, and I was just hoping he'd become something else. Now, I realize it's unfair to expect someone to change for you. Love the person as they are, not as you want them to be. Edit. And no, he didn't change after we broke up. He's still the same guy I left. Story 46. Back then, I thought I could handle long distance without really talking about our plans. I dated someone who lived halfway across the country, and we were both excited and optimistic. But we never actually discussed how we'd make it work, when we'd visit, or if one of us would eventually move. We just kept going, hoping things would magically fall into place. After months of frustration and miscommunication, it finally hit me that relationships need a real plan, not just wishful thinking. If I could go back, I'd remind myself to think practically and discuss the tough stuff up front. Story 47. I'd tell myself not to date someone just because they seem perfect on paper. When I started dating this guy, it felt like everything lined up perfectly. He had a stable, successful career, was charming and well-spoken, and everyone around us thought we were the perfect couple. He was the kind of person who checked all the boxes people say you should look for in a partner, and I felt lucky to be with someone who seemed so ideal. But when it was just the two of us, things felt different. Our conversations felt forced, like we were trying too hard to find common ground. Even on our dates, I felt like I was putting on a bit of an act, trying to match his energy and interest rather than genuinely being myself. I wanted so much to believe we were as great as everyone thought, but deep down, I knew we didn't really connect. I ignored my gut feeling, hoping that maybe chemistry would grow over time, or that I was just overthinking it. Eventually, I realized that no amount of outside validation or social approval could make up for the lack of a genuine bond. I learned that it's far more important to be with someone who makes you feel at ease and truly understood than to be with someone who simply looks good to others. It was a hard lesson, but now I know that relationships should feel natural, not like you're forcing pieces together. Edit. For those who asked, yes, he moved on quickly too. In the end, it was a relief for both of us, and we're both in better places now. Story 48. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that it's okay to take breaks in a relationship if it's needed. I dated this girl who was going through some intense life changes, and we both became overwhelmed. We started arguing constantly, and every interaction felt tense. But I kept pushing through, thinking that taking a break would mean we were failing. Now I realize that sometimes a little space can help both people get perspective and recharge. It's not giving up. It's giving each other time to come back stronger. I learned that healthy space can be good. Story 49. I'd remind my younger self that jealousy isn't a sign of love. I was with this guy who'd constantly get jealous whenever I'd hang out with my friends or even talk to other people. At first, I thought it was flattering, like he cared about me so much. But over time, it became stifling. I couldn't do anything without feeling guilty, or like I was somehow betraying him. Looking back, I know now that real love is about trust, not ownership. If someone's always questioning your loyalty, they don't trust you enough to be with you. Edit. Yes, he tried reaching out after we broke up, but I didn't go back. I needed freedom. Story 50. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that ignoring red flags won't make them disappear. I dated someone who had a lot of issues with anger. He'd lose his temper over the smallest things. I'd always make excuses, telling myself he'd calm down eventually, or that it was just because he was stressed. I figured if I stayed supportive, things would improve. But they didn't, and I ended up more stressed than he was. Now I know that red flags are there for a reason, and ignoring them only prolongs the inevitable. Edit. And yes, to those wondering, I've learned to recognize those signs much sooner now. Story 51. I'd go back and tell myself not to let someone take advantage of my kindness. I dated this girl who was always in a tough spot. Money issues, problems with her family, drama with friends. I kept stepping in to help her because I cared, and at first it felt good to support someone I loved. But eventually, I realized that she wasn't making an effort to fix things on her own. I was doing all the work, emotionally and financially, and she seemed perfectly comfortable with that. In the end, I felt used, and it took me a long time to get over it. Now I know that helping someone is fine, but if they're not meeting you halfway, it's not worth draining yourself. Story 52. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that it's okay to have standards. I dated a guy who had a lot of bad habits: smoking, skipping work, barely managing his responsibilities. I thought I could look past it, that maybe my love would inspire him to improve. But after months of making excuses for him and convincing myself that he'd change, I realized that I was just settling for someone who wasn't interested in bettering himself. Now, I tell myself that standards aren't too much to ask for. They're necessary to find someone who truly matches your values and goals. Story 53. I'd remind myself that a good relationship shouldn't feel like walking on eggshells. My ex had a quick temper, and I'd find myself constantly second-guessing everything I said or did, just to avoid setting him off. I was so focused on keeping the peace that I lost sight of my own needs and opinions. I thought it was my responsibility to keep him calm, but looking back, I see how unfair that was to myself. A healthy relationship doesn't make you feel like you're one wrong word away from an argument. I'd tell my younger self to prioritize my peace of mind. Edit. For everyone asking, yes, I'm in a much calmer, happier relationship now. I learned what real peace feels like. Story 54. If I could give myself advice, I'd say don't ignore signs of selfishness. I dated a girl who always put herself first, even if it meant inconveniencing me. She'd cancel plans last minute, take forever to respond to messages, and generally treated me as an afterthought. I kept telling myself that maybe she was just busy or distracted, but over time, it became clear that she just didn't value our relationship as much as I did. I learned that love should be mutual effort, not one person always giving while the other takes. Now I know that both people need to show up fully. Story 55. I'd tell myself not to date someone just because they're super charming. My ex was charismatic, funny, and had this way of making me feel special. But beneath the charm, he was unreliable, rarely followed through on promises, and could be distant for days without an explanation. I kept holding on to the moments when he was sweet and attentive, hoping that was the real him. Eventually, I realized that charm without consistency isn't enough. It's like trying to build a house on sand. Now, I value people who are genuine and dependable, not just smooth talkers. Edit. Yes, it was hard to let go, but it was definitely the right choice in the end. Story 56. I wish I could tell my younger self that trust isn't something you can force, no matter how much you want it to be there. I was in a relationship where, from the start, I felt this underlying sense of insecurity. I'd often wonder if she was truly committed, or if she was hiding things from me. When I brought it up, she'd say I was overthinking or being paranoid, making me feel like I was the one causing problems in the relationship. But every now and then, I'd stumble upon things that made me question everything, like hidden conversations she kept just between friends or moments where she'd avoid sharing details about her day. I really wanted to believe her, so I kept convincing myself that I just needed to relax, that I needed to give her the benefit of the doubt. But those little doubts would creep in at the worst times, and I found myself always second-guessing her words and actions. It was exhausting trying to keep faith in something that didn't feel solid. Over time, I realized that trust can't be built when one person isn't fully open. If someone is keeping parts of their life separate, it can create a constant sense of worry and insecurity, no matter how hard you try to ignore it. Looking back, I tell myself that trust isn't something you should have to work so hard to maintain. It's either there or it's not. If you're feeling that kind of anxiety, it might be a sign that something is missing in the relationship. Trust should bring peace, not stress. Story 57. If I could go back, I'd remind myself not to prioritize someone who only sees me as an option. I dated this guy who was always busy with work, friends, and hobbies. I didn't mind at first, but eventually, it felt like I was always waiting around for him to have time for me. I rearranged my own plans, hoping he'd notice, but I realized I was just another item on his list. Now, I know that love is about making each other a priority, not just fitting someone in when it's convenient. I deserve someone who makes time for me. Edit. And yes, I finally ended it and found someone who values my time just as much as I value his. Story 58. I tell myself that words mean nothing without actions. My ex would say all the right things, promising we'd go on trips together, talking about our future, and always saying how much he cared. But when it came down to it, he rarely followed through. Plans would fall through, and I'd end up disappointed. I kept holding on to his words, hoping he'd eventually live up to them. In the end, I realized that if someone's actions don't match their promises, it's just empty talk. Now I know to watch what people do, not just what they say. Story 59. If I could give myself advice, I'd say never put your own goals on hold for someone else. I was with this girl who was always asking me to compromise my plans. I skipped out on a job opportunity because she didn't want me to move, missed out on trips because she didn't want to be alone, and generally felt like I was losing parts of myself. I thought I was being selfless, but I was really just sacrificing my own happiness. Now, I know that real love doesn't ask you to put your dreams on the back burner. I tell my younger self to prioritize my goals too. Edit. And yes, I'm finally pursuing those goals. It took time, but I'm on my own path now. Story 60. I tell myself that staying in a relationship out of guilt never ends well. I dated someone who was going through a rough time, and every time I thought about breaking up, I felt terrible. I didn't want to add to his problems, so I stuck around, even though I knew deep down it wasn't working. But the longer I stayed, the harder it became, and the guilt only grew. Eventually, I realized that staying out of pity isn't fair to either person. It's better to be honest, even if it hurts, than to drag things out. Edit. For those asking, he did end up finding someone who made him happier. Sometimes, letting go is the kindest thing. Story 61. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that communication is a two-way street. I dated this girl who'd always say she wanted me to open up more, so I did. I started sharing my thoughts, my dreams, and even my insecurities with her. But every time I tried to talk about something that bothered me, she'd shut down or change the subject. It felt like she wanted me to be vulnerable, but didn't want to hear anything negative. In the end, I realized that real communication means both people can share and be heard. If someone can't handle your truth, they're not the right person. Story 62. I tell myself not to date someone just because they need you. I was in a relationship with someone who was going through a difficult time, and she leaned on me for almost everything. At first, I felt valued and important, like I was making a difference in her life. I provided emotional support whenever she needed to talk, helped her financially when things got tight, and even made decisions for her when she felt overwhelmed. I thought all of this meant that I was truly special to her, that my support was strengthening our bond. But over time, I started feeling worn out. It seemed like the relationship was always focused on her struggles, her needs, and what I could do to help her. The more I gave, the more she depended on me, and I started to realize that she wasn't looking at me as a partner, but as someone to lean on. It became clear that she didn't love me for who I was. She just needed someone to keep her afloat. Looking back, I've learned that love shouldn't be about filling someone else's voids. While it's natural to support someone you care about, a relationship should feel balanced, where both people bring their own strength to the table. It's not healthy to be the only thing holding someone together. They need to find their own stability, their own foundation, so that you can both stand strong as individuals in the relationship. Story 63. If I could go back, I'd remind myself that criticism disguised as jokes is still criticism. My ex would make these little jabs about my weight, my job, or my hobbies, always adding, "I'm just kidding." I laughed it off, thinking maybe I was just too sensitive. But after a while, those jokes started to wear me down. I felt like I couldn't do anything right without getting mocked. In a healthy relationship, you should feel respected, not ridiculed. I'd tell myself to listen to how their words make me feel, not just brush them off. Edit. And to answer the question, no, I didn't confront her at the time. I wish I had. Story 64. I'd go back and tell myself that it's okay to put my happiness first. I dated this guy who was very intense. He'd always need me to be around, always call me several times a day, and get upset if I even thought of doing something alone. I thought it was sweet at first, but it quickly started feeling suffocating. I felt guilty every time I did anything for myself, like I was betraying him. Now, I know that love shouldn't come with that kind of pressure. You should be able to have your own life and happiness without feeling bad about it. Story 65. If I could go back, I'd tell myself to pay attention to how I felt in their presence. I was in a relationship where I always felt nervous and unsure. I kept blaming myself, thinking it was just my insecurities and that I had to try harder to make things work. But looking back, I realized that was my intuition telling me something was off. Now, I know that real love doesn't make you feel anxious all the time. It should bring peace, not stress. I'd tell my younger self to trust that feeling instead of brushing it aside. Edit. And yes, I eventually learned to listen to my gut, saved me from a few more bad situations. Story 66. I'd tell myself not to sacrifice my friendships for a relationship. I dated a girl who always wanted me around, so I started canceling plans with friends to spend more time with her. I thought I was being a good boyfriend, but over time I lost touch with people who'd been there for me for years. When the relationship ended, I realized how isolated I'd become. Now, I know that a healthy relationship doesn't ask you to cut ties with your support system. True love respects your friendships and encourages you to keep them. Story 67. If I could go back, I'd remind myself that people often show you who they truly are early on. Believe them the first time. When I started dating her, she was always late, missing plans or rescheduling last minute. At first, I thought it was just part of her personality, that she was a free spirit who didn't want to be tied down by routines. I convinced myself it was charming, and maybe even a little exciting to be with someone so spontaneous. But as time went on, I noticed that it wasn't just about being late or changing plans. She was also unreliable in other areas, forgetting things that were important to me, skipping out on things she promised to do, and brushing off commitments like they didn't matter. I kept thinking that, with time, she'd become more consistent, more invested. I tried to be understanding, thinking that if I were patient, she'd eventually grow to be the partner I hoped for. But the reality was that her behavior never changed. Her constant excuses and missed promises weren't temporary quirks. They were habits. I learned the hard way that when someone shows you who they are from the start, it's wise to accept it instead of waiting for them to become someone different. Edit. And for those asking, yes, she's still the same way. Some things and some habits just don't change. Story 68. I'd tell myself that respect goes both ways. I was in a relationship where I was constantly bending over backward to make my partner happy, but she rarely did the same for me. If I ever needed something, there was always an excuse or a reason why it was inconvenient for her. I kept telling myself I was just being generous, but over time, it started to feel really one-sided. Looking back, I know that true respect means both people make an effort. You shouldn't feel like you're always giving without receiving. Story 69. If I could go back, I'd remind myself that compatibility matters as much as chemistry. I dated a guy I was insanely attracted to, and our chemistry was off the charts. But outside of that, we had almost nothing in common. Different lifestyles, goals, even values. I kept pushing those things aside because I was so drawn to him. But eventually, the differences became too much. I learned that physical attraction alone isn't enough to sustain a relationship. You need a foundation that goes beyond the surface. Edit. And yes, we had a hard time letting go. Sometimes chemistry keeps you holding on way longer than you should. Story 70. I'd tell my younger self that jealousy doesn't make a relationship stronger. My ex was constantly suspicious, always asking who I was texting, where I was going, and even wanted access to my social media. I thought if I just reassured him enough, things would get better. But no amount of reassurance was enough, and his jealousy started to feel like a cage. Now, I know that love is built on trust, not constant monitoring. If someone doesn't trust you, it's going to be an uphill battle no matter what. Edit. For those asking, no, I never gave him a reason to be jealous. It was all his own insecurity. Story 71. If I could go back, I'd remind myself that respect should come before love. I dated someone who I was crazy about, but they'd often make little comments that put me down. They'd say things like, "You're lucky to have me," or, "Most people wouldn't put up with you." I thought they were just joking, but after a while, I started to believe them. I felt like I had to constantly prove my worth in the relationship. Now, I know that love without respect doesn't mean much. If someone's always making you feel small, it's not real love, it's control. Story 72. I tell my younger self not to ignore when a relationship brings out the worst in you. I was with someone who was so critical and negative that I found myself snapping back, getting defensive, and becoming someone I didn't like. We'd have arguments that would drag on for days, and I felt constantly on edge. I told myself it was just normal couple stuff, but honestly, I didn't like the person I was around them. Looking back, I'd say if a relationship makes you feel like you're becoming someone you don't recognize, it's time to walk away. Story 73. If I could go back, I'd remind myself that real love isn't conditional. I dated a guy who would constantly set conditions for his affection. He'd only be nice to me if I'd do things his way, if I'd agree with him, or if I didn't bother him about seeing other people. I thought if I kept meeting his standards, he'd start treating me better. But the truth is, he just kept raising the bar, and I kept feeling like I wasn't good enough. Now, I know that love isn't about conditions, it's about acceptance. No one should make you feel like love is something you have to earn. Edit. To answer everyone asking, I did leave him, and it was the best choice I ever made. Story 74. I'd tell myself not to let anyone turn me into an emotional punching bag. When I was dating this girl, it seemed like she was always in a bad mood or dealing with some kind of frustration. I thought that, as her boyfriend, it was my job to lift her up, to be her support whenever she needed it. Whenever she was upset or angry, I'd drop whatever I was doing to be by her side, to listen, to try to lighten her mood, to remind her of all the good things in life. I wanted to believe that, with enough care and patience, I could help her see past her frustrations. But no matter how much I tried, there was always something new for her to be upset about. I started to feel like I could never do enough, that I was failing her in some way. Her constant anger and negativity began to drain me. I went from feeling like her partner to feeling like her emotional caretaker, and it took a toll on my own sense of self-worth. I felt stuck, constantly trying to make her happy, but never quite succeeding, like I was responsible for keeping her stable. Looking back, I realized that in a healthy relationship, each person is responsible for managing their own emotions. No one deserves to be the outlet for someone else's frustrations. Supporting each other is natural, But it shouldn't mean carrying all of the other person's emotional weight. We each have to be able to stand on our own, too. Story 75. If I could go back, I'd tell myself to watch how someone treats people they don't need in their life. My ex was always sweet to me, but he was rude to strangers, waiters, cashiers, even people on the street. I thought it didn't matter because he treated me well. But eventually, that attitude started seeping into our relationship. He started treating me like I wasn't important anymore, too. Now, I tell myself that kindness isn't just about how they treat you, it's how they treat everyone. If they lack respect for others, it'll eventually come out with you, too. Edit. And yes, he reached out afterward, but by then, I was done with it. Story 76. I'd go back and tell myself that love doesn't have to be hard to be real. I was in a relationship that was constantly filled with drama, arguments, and misunderstandings. I thought that's just how passionate love was, intense and full of ups and downs. But looking back, I realized it was just toxic. Real love shouldn't make you feel like you're riding a roller coaster all the time. Now, I know that the right relationship will feel steady and secure, not like an emotional storm. Love can be peaceful, and that's a good thing. Story 77. If I could go back, I'd tell myself not to keep secrets to avoid conflict. I dated someone who would get upset over the smallest things, so I started keeping secrets to avoid arguments. I'd hide harmless things, like spending time with friends or buying something small for myself, just to keep the peace. But over time, the secrets added up, and it felt like I was living a double life. Now I realize that honesty is the foundation of trust. If you feel like you have to lie to keep someone happy, it's probably not a healthy relationship. Edit. And yes, it took me a long time to stop that habit after we broke up. Being open feels so much better. Story 78. I tell myself that a healthy relationship shouldn't make you feel guilty for setting personal boundaries. With my ex, it always felt like I could never give enough. She constantly wanted more of my time, more of my attention. And whenever I mentioned needing a bit of space or some alone time to recharge, she'd act hurt or disappointed. I began to feel selfish, as though taking time for myself was somehow neglecting her or letting her down. Over time, I'd start avoiding asking for any space at all, afraid of the tension it might cause. I ended up feeling completely drained, like I was losing pieces of myself. I felt like I had no right to say no or prioritize my own needs. I realized I was neglecting my own well-being just to keep the peace and avoid conflict. Looking back, I understand now that boundaries aren't just a nice idea. They're essential for any healthy relationship. They allow both people to maintain their own sense of self and mental balance. A partner who truly cares will understand that taking time for yourself doesn't mean you care any less about them. Now, I know that setting boundaries is an important part of self-care, and a relationship that respects those boundaries is the kind that will last. Taking care of yourself doesn't mean neglecting your partner. It actually allows you to be more present and more balanced when you're together. Story 79. If I could go back, I'd remind myself that mutual support is everything. I dated a guy who never showed any interest in my life, my goals, or my achievements. Whenever I'd tell him something I was excited about, he'd either ignore it or change the subject to himself. I felt like I was always cheering for him, but he wasn't there for me. Eventually, I realized that love means rooting for each other's happiness. You deserve someone who's genuinely excited about your wins, not someone who only cares about their own. Story 80. I'd tell myself not to mistake control for care. My ex was always trying to control every part of my life. What I wore, who I hung out with, even the movies I watched. He'd say it was because he cared about me, but I started feeling like I was losing my sense of self. I couldn't make a decision without wondering how he'd react. Now, I know that love respects your independence. If someone truly cares, they'll support you as you are, not try to mold you into their ideal. Edit. For everyone asking, I did finally leave, and it was like a weight lifted. Control isn't care. Story 81. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that I don't need to compete for someone's attention. I was in a relationship where my partner was constantly texting other people, spending time with friends, and barely making an effort with me. I'd try harder every time, planning dates, buying little gifts, just hoping he'd notice me more. But nothing changed. He still treated me like an option. Now I know that if someone truly cares, they'll make you feel like a priority without you having to fight for it. Love shouldn't feel like a competition. Story 82. I'd remind myself never to lose my voice in a relationship. I was with someone who had a strong take-charge personality. He always took the lead, deciding where we'd go, what we'd do, and even suggesting what I should order when we went out. At first, I thought it was nice that he was decisive. I assumed I was just being flexible and easygoing. I'd tell myself it was no big deal to go along with his preferences, thinking that compromise meant letting him take the lead. But as time went on, I started to notice how little my own preferences mattered in the relationship. I'd find myself agreeing to plans I didn't enjoy, saying yes to things I wasn't comfortable with, all just to avoid any conflict or keep him happy. Gradually, it felt like my opinions and choices were disappearing. I started feeling resentful, like I was living in his world instead of ours. Looking back, I realized that a relationship should be a partnership where both voices are valued equally. Compromise doesn't mean surrendering your own opinions. It means both people having a say. It's important to feel that your needs, choices, and comfort are just as significant as your partner's. Now I know that my voice deserves to be heard and respected in any relationship. A healthy partnership is about balance, not one person calling all the shots. Story 83. If I could go back, I'd tell myself not to change my values just to keep someone. I dated this girl who had very different views on life, from career goals to family values. I wanted so badly for things to work that I'd downplay what I wanted or pretend her views were mine. I was scared she'd leave if I showed my true self. In the end, it just led to resentment and frustration. Now, I know that being with someone who shares your values is essential. Don't sacrifice your core beliefs to keep someone around. Edit. Yes, I did eventually find someone who matches my values, and it's made all the difference. Story 84. I'd go back and tell myself that it's okay to set boundaries without feeling guilty. I dated someone who was always pushing my limits, wanting more of my time, my energy, and even my money. Anytime I tried to set a boundary, he'd accuse me of being selfish or of not caring enough. I thought I was doing the right thing by bending over backward, but it left me drained. Now I know that love should never make you feel guilty for putting yourself first when you need to. Boundaries are healthy and necessary for any relationship. Story 85. If I could give myself advice, I'd say not to get stuck in the potential of someone. My ex had so many big dreams, but no motivation to follow through. I kept holding on, thinking, one day he'll change, and things will be amazing. But years went by, and he never changed. I was in love with who he could be, not who he actually was. Now I know that you have to love someone as they are, not for who you think they might become. If you're waiting on potential, you'll be waiting forever. Edit. And yes, he's still the same, big dreams but no action, lesson learned. Story 86. I tell myself that it's okay to walk away if the relationship is one-sided. I was with someone who never put in the same effort I did. I'd plan things, show up when they needed me, and always be there, but they rarely reciprocated. I kept thinking they'd change, that they'd start showing up the way I did, but it never happened. Now I know that relationships should be mutual. If you're the only one making an effort, it's time to move on. You deserve someone who invests in you as much as you invest in them. Story 87. If I could go back, I'd remind myself not to settle for good enough. I dated a guy who was nice, but didn't really make me feel special. Our conversations were dull, and I never felt that spark. I stayed because I figured he was a good person, and maybe I was being too picky. But as time went on, I realized I was just bored and unsatisfied. Now I know that it's okay to want more in a relationship. You shouldn't have to settle for something that doesn't make you genuinely happy. Edit. To those wondering, yes, I eventually found someone who lights me up in all the right ways. Story 88. I'd go back and tell myself not to ignore signs of manipulation. I was with someone who would twist everything I said to make me feel like the bad guy. If I brought up a concern, they'd turn it around, making me feel like I was being unreasonable or overly sensitive. It took me a long time to realize they were manipulating me into questioning myself. Now, I know that healthy communication doesn't make you feel crazy or guilty. Love should feel safe, not like a mind game. Story 89. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that shared goals are essential in a relationship. When I dated my ex, I realized early on that we were on different paths, but I convinced myself it would work out. I had a clear vision of what I wanted in life. I dreamed of building a career, traveling to new places, and eventually settling down. He, on the other hand, seemed perfectly comfortable with where he was. He didn't have any real plans, didn't talk about the future, and was content just coasting along. At first, I thought it was just a phase, that maybe he'd become more motivated, or that we could start building a future together over time. But as the months went by, it became clear that he wasn't interested in making plans or setting goals. I was pushing forward, while he stayed in the same place, content with things just as they were. It created this silent tension between us, with me constantly hoping he'd change, and him wondering why I couldn't just relax and accept things as they were. Now, I know that for a relationship to grow, both people need to be moving in a similar direction. Shared goals give you something to work toward together and help you feel like a team. Without that, it's like you're living in two separate worlds. Edit. And yes, I'm with someone now who shares my vision for the future, and it's amazing to feel like we're truly building something together. Story 90. I tell myself not to let love turn into an obligation. My ex went through a rough time, and I felt like I couldn't leave, even when the relationship was no longer healthy for me. I was so focused on being there for them that I forgot to take care of myself. I stayed out of guilt, thinking I owed it to them, but it only made things harder for both of us in the long run. Now, I know that love isn't about feeling trapped. You can care for someone without sacrificing your own well-being. Sometimes, walking away is the kindest thing you can do. Edit. And yes, we both ended up in a better place afterward. Leaving wasn't easy, but it was the right choice. Story 91. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that love shouldn't make you feel exhausted. I was in a relationship where every day felt like a challenge to keep things together. I was always the one planning, fixing, and apologizing just to keep the peace. I thought that if I just put in enough effort, things would eventually smooth out, but it was like running on a treadmill, getting nowhere. Now, I realize that love should feel like a partnership, not a solo job. If one person is carrying all the weight, it's not going to work. Story 92. I'd remind myself that jealousy isn't something you can fix for someone else. I was with a girl who got upset anytime I talked to another woman, even if it was just a coworker or an old friend. I thought if I was just transparent enough, if I told her everything, the jealousy would go away. But it didn't. No matter what I did, she'd always find a reason to doubt me. Eventually, I learned that jealousy is something they have to work on themselves. You can't prove your loyalty over and over without burning out. Story 93. If I could go back, I'd remind myself that sometimes being single is healthier than being in a bad relationship. I stayed with someone who was constantly putting me down because I thought it was better than being alone. I convinced myself that I wouldn't find anyone better, so I put up with behavior that chipped away at my self-esteem bit by bit. Looking back, I wish I'd realized that there's nothing wrong with taking time to be on your own. Sometimes you need that space to remember your worth. Edit. And yes, after I left, I found someone who respects and values me. Being single in between was worth it. Story 94. I tell my younger self to pay attention to those little signs of selfishness. They're often bigger than they seem. When I was with my ex, it felt like everything revolved around him. His schedule, his priorities, his needs. Whether it was something as simple as picking a place to eat or deciding how to spend the weekend, his preferences always took center stage. If I ever voiced something I wanted or needed, he'd either brush it off or make me feel like I was being unreasonable. I'd ask for a bit of compromise, and he'd somehow turn it into a conversation about why his plans or his time were more important. I kept convincing myself that maybe he'd become more thoughtful over time. I made excuses for him, thinking he just didn't realize how self-centered he was being. But as our relationship went on, it became clear that he wasn't interested in changing or seeing things from my perspective. His world was the only one he cared about, and I was expected to fit into it, rather than us building a shared life together. Looking back, I now understand that a healthy relationship is about both people giving and receiving. It's about creating something together where both voices matter. True love isn't about one person's world. It's about two people making room for each other, balancing each other's needs, and building something meaningful as a team. Story 95. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting who you are. I dated someone who'd mess up constantly and then apologize, expecting me to move on like nothing happened. I forgave over and over until I didn't even recognize my own boundaries anymore. I was so focused on keeping the peace that I lost sight of my own values and standards. Now, I've learned that forgiveness is important, but it doesn't mean letting go of self-respect. You can forgive someone without letting them keep crossing your lines. Edit. Yes, it took time to rebuild my boundaries, but it was worth it. Self-respect is everything. Story 96. I'd tell myself not to fall into the trap of being someone's fixer. My ex had a lot of issues. Troubles at work, problems with family, personal struggles, and I thought that if I could just be there for him enough, things would get better. I ended up taking on all his problems as if they were my own, neglecting my own needs to support him. Eventually, I realized that people have to want to change for themselves. You can support someone, but you can't carry their burdens alone. Real love doesn't mean sacrificing yourself. Story 97. If I could go back, I'd remind myself that a relationship without trust is a constant struggle. I was with a guy who would check my phone, question where I'd been, and constantly doubt my loyalty. I tried everything to prove I was faithful, but nothing worked. I was walking on eggshells, always worried about saying or doing something that would set him off. Now, I know that trust is the foundation of a healthy relationship. If it's not there, you're just spinning your wheels trying to fix something that's already broken. Edit. And no, I didn't stay long after realizing it wasn't getting better. Leaving was hard, but necessary. Story 98. I tell myself that staying true to your passions is important. My ex wasn't interested in any of the things I loved, my hobbies, my career goals, even my taste in music. At first, I tried to downplay my interests to match hers, hoping it would bring us closer. But over time, I felt like I was losing a part of myself, just to fit into her world. Now, I know that the right person will appreciate what makes you unique. You shouldn't have to give up your passions to make a relationship work. Story 99. If I could go back, I'd tell myself not to wait around for someone who isn't fully committed. I dated someone who would always keep things casual, saying they weren't ready for anything serious. I kept thinking they'd eventually change their mind, but years passed, and they were still keeping me at a distance. I was holding on to a future that was never going to happen. Now, I know that if someone isn't ready to commit, it's better to let go and find someone who is. Don't waste time waiting for what might never come. Edit. To answer the questions, yes, I did move on, and I'm much happier with someone who's truly in it with me. Story 100. I'd remind myself that real love doesn't feel like a game. My ex had a habit of playing these constant mind games. One day, he'd be warm and attentive, and the next, he'd go cold, pulling away just enough to make me question everything. I'd find myself analyzing every little thing he did, trying to figure out what he was thinking or if I had done something wrong. When I'd get tired of the chase and start to pull back, he'd suddenly come back into my life, making grand gestures or saying just the right words to keep me holding on. At the time, I convinced myself that this was just part of keeping things interesting, that maybe this was his way of showing he cared. But in reality, all it did was make me feel insecure and constantly uncertain about where we stood. Instead of feeling safe and valued, I felt like I was on a roller coaster, always guessing, always trying to keep up. Looking back, I know now that love should bring clarity, not confusion. True love isn't about keeping someone on edge or playing hard to get. Games may add a thrill, but they don't create a solid foundation. Real love is steady, something you can trust and rely on, not something you feel you have to chase. Edit. And no, I haven't spoken to him since. I've learned my lesson, and I'm done with people who make love feel like a guessing game. Story 101. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that healthy love isn't built on fear. I dated someone who was so controlling that I started changing how I acted just to avoid upsetting him. I'd hide little things like talking to friends or going out without him knowing, just to keep the peace. I thought I was compromising, but really, I was just living in constant fear of conflict. Now, I know that a good relationship doesn't make you feel like you have to walk on eggshells. Love shouldn't feel like a weight pressing down on you. Story 102. I'd remind myself that a good relationship doesn't drain your energy. It fills you up. I was in a relationship where I always felt tired, emotionally, mentally, even physically. My partner was constantly in need of support, reassurance, and attention, and I thought I could handle it. But after a while, I felt like I was running on empty, with nothing left for myself. Looking back, I know that love shouldn't feel like an endless drain. Real love lifts you up and makes you feel stronger, not weaker. Story 103. If I could go back, I'd remind myself that happiness isn't just about making someone else happy. I dated someone who always needed things to be exactly his way, and I went along with it because I thought that's what love was. Putting him first, even at my own expense. But after a while, I realized I was ignoring my own happiness, just to keep him satisfied. Now, I know that my happiness matters too, and compromise goes both ways. You shouldn't lose yourself in trying to please someone else. Edit. And to everyone asking, yes, I did leave, and finally started prioritizing my own happiness. Story 104. I tell myself not to keep trying to fix what's already broken. I was in a relationship with someone who, from the very beginning, seemed distant and emotionally closed off. I could sense that they were holding back, never fully letting me in. But I kept telling myself that with enough time and patience, they'd finally open up. I poured so much energy into trying to be there for them, showing that they could trust me, hoping they'd eventually feel safe enough to share their true self with me. I thought that if I just loved them enough, I could break through the walls they'd built around themselves. But each time I tried to connect, I felt like I was pushing against a barrier that wouldn't budge. Instead of feeling fulfilled, I was left drained and frustrated, waiting for something that was never going to happen. It took me a long time to realize that some people aren't ready or willing to open up, and it wasn't my responsibility to make them change. Looking back, I see now that not everything is meant to be fixed, and that's okay. Some relationships simply aren't meant to work out, no matter how much you want them to. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is recognize when to let go, move on, and make room in your life for a relationship that truly fulfills you. Story 105. If I could go back, I'd remind myself that perfect isn't always real. My ex was charming, successful, and everyone thought we were the ideal couple. I was so focused on maintaining that image that I ignored the red flags. His need to control everything, his lack of empathy, and his tendency to gaslight me when I brought up issues. I thought keeping up the appearance of perfection would somehow make things right. Now, I know that true love isn't about being perfect. It's about being real. No image is worth sacrificing your peace of mind. Edit. Yes, it took a long time to get over, but I'm much happier being with someone who values honesty over appearances. Story 106. I tell myself not to ignore my own boundaries for someone else's comfort. My ex would constantly push my limits, whether it was with time, physical space, or emotional demands. I thought being flexible made me a better partner, but in reality, I was just letting him disregard what I needed to feel safe and comfortable. Now, I know that boundaries aren't selfish, they're essential. Real love respects your boundaries and doesn't make you feel bad for having them. Story 107. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that love isn't about saving someone. I dated someone who had a lot of issues and thought if I could just love him enough, I could make things better. I ended up taking on his problems like they were my own, thinking I could fix everything for him. but it didn't work. And in the end, I felt like I'd lost myself in his struggles. Now, I know that each person is responsible for their own healing. You can support someone, but you can't be their savior. Edit. And yes, he's since found help on his own. It took time, but he's better, and so am I. Story 108. I tell myself that someone who truly loves you will be proud of you, not threatened by your success. When I was with my ex, I noticed that anytime something positive happened in my life, whether it was a promotion, praise from my friends, or even a small personal achievement, he'd react with irritation or make dismissive comments. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding, or maybe he was just having a rough day. But eventually, it became clear that he didn't like seeing me succeed. It was as if my accomplishments made him uncomfortable, as though they somehow took away from him. I found myself downplaying my achievements, brushing off compliments, and even keeping good news to myself, just to avoid making him feel uneasy. I thought I was being considerate, but over time, it felt stifling. I was dimming my own light just to make sure he wasn't overshadowed. Instead of feeling supported, I felt like I had to choose between my growth and our relationship. Looking back, I realized that a partner should be your biggest cheerleader, the one who lifts you up and celebrates every success with you. Love means wanting the best for each other, not feeling threatened by each other's achievements. You deserve someone who not only accepts your growth, but takes joy in it, knowing that when you shine, it only strengthens the relationship. Story 109. If I could go back, I'd remind myself not to be in a relationship just for the sake of having one. I was with someone who I wasn't truly compatible with, but I stayed because I thought being in any relationship was better than being alone. I ignored all the signs that we weren't a good match and convinced myself that I just needed to try harder. Now, I know that being single is better than being with the wrong person. You don't need to force something that doesn't feel right. Edit. And yes, being single taught me a lot about who I am and what I want. It was worth the time. Story 110. I tell myself that real love isn't afraid to talk about the hard stuff. My ex avoided any serious conversations about the future, our goals, or even things that bothered us in the relationship. I went along with it, thinking it was better to keep things light and easy. But eventually, the lack of communication caught up with us, and we ended up resenting each other for things we never addressed. Now, I know that true love isn't afraid of uncomfortable conversations. If you can't talk openly, it's hard to grow together. Edit. To everyone asking, yes, I'm now with someone who communicates openly, and it's a whole new world. Story 111. If I could go back, I'd tell myself not to mistake intensity for love. I was in a relationship that was super passionate, but also incredibly unstable. We'd have huge fights, followed by big dramatic makeups, and I thought that was just part of being in love. But the roller coaster started to wear me down emotionally, and I realized that it wasn't healthy. Now, I know that love can be steady and still be real. Intensity doesn't equal depth, and real love shouldn't leave you feeling exhausted all the time. Story 112. I'd remind myself that being in a relationship doesn't mean giving up your own friends. My ex was always jealous of my friends and didn't like me hanging out without him. I started seeing less and less of them to avoid arguments, and eventually, I felt isolated and dependent on him for everything. When we broke up, I realized how much of my support system I'd lost along the way. Now, I know that a healthy relationship encourages you to keep your friendships strong. No one should make you feel guilty for having people in your life outside of them. Story 113. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that honesty matters even when it's hard. I dated someone who avoided conflict at all costs, which meant they'd never tell me if something was wrong or if I'd done something to upset them. I thought it was nice to never fight, but over time, it felt like I was walking on a blank canvas with no idea of where we stood. When we finally did argue, everything came out at once, and it was overwhelming. Now, I realized that a few honest small conflicts along the way are way healthier than bottling everything up. Edit. For everyone wondering, yes, we parted on good terms, and I learned to value honesty a lot more. Story 114. I'd go back and tell myself not to let insecurity keep me from expressing my needs. My ex made me feel like I was needy for wanting to spend time together or talk about our future. I kept quiet, afraid he'd see me as clingy, and so I went along with whatever he wanted. Eventually, I realized I wasn't getting what I needed, and I was the one feeling unfulfilled. Now, I know that it's okay to have needs and express them. The right person will listen and care about meeting you halfway. Story 115. If I could give myself advice, I'd say don't ignore the signs of emotional unavailability. I dated someone who was really charming and fun to be around, but when it came to deeper stuff, he'd shut down completely. I kept thinking that if I was just patient enough, he'd open up. But after a while, I realized that he wasn't ready for the kind of relationship I wanted, and I was just waiting around for something that wasn't going to happen. Looking back, I tell myself not to wait for someone to change. You deserve someone who's emotionally available from the start. Edit. And yes, he's still the same. Some people just aren't ready, and that's okay. Story 116. I'd remind myself that love doesn't mean ignoring red flags. My ex had issues with anger, and I kept telling myself it would get better. I thought that if I was supportive enough, he'd learn to manage it. But after a while, it became clear that he wasn't trying to change, and I was just excusing behavior that made me feel unsafe. Now, I know that love doesn't mean tolerating things that make you uncomfortable. Red flags are there for a reason. Trust them. Story 117. If I could go back, I'd tell myself not to stay in a relationship just because of time invested. I was with someone for years, and I kept telling myself that we had to make it work because we'd been together for so long. But deep down, I knew we were growing apart and wanted different things. I was just too afraid to walk away because I didn't want all that time to feel wasted. Now, I realize that staying just because of the past isn't worth it. Your happiness matters in the present, and it's okay to let go. Edit. And yes, we both moved on and found better matches. No time is wasted if you learn something from it. Story 118. I tell myself that self-respect comes first. I was in a relationship where my partner would constantly push my boundaries, and instead of standing my ground, I'd give in, thinking it would make things easier. I didn't want to rock the boat, but eventually, I realized that I was losing respect for myself in the process. Now, I know that respecting yourself is essential. If you don't value your own boundaries, no one else will either. Story 119. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that long-distance relationships need a plan. I was in a long-distance relationship where we kept telling ourselves we'd figure it out, but neither of us was making concrete plans for the future. After a while, it just felt like we were drifting apart, and I realized we were both avoiding making real decisions. Looking back, I tell myself that long distance only works if both people are committed to finding a way to be together. Without a plan, it's hard to stay connected. Edit. And yes, we eventually ended things, but we're both happier now. Story 120. I tell myself that being too nice isn't a badge of honor. I was in a relationship where I would always give in, always apologize first, and never stand up for myself. I thought I was being kind, but in reality I was just letting myself get walked over. I thought my niceness would make things better, but it only made me resentful and unhappy. Now, I know that kindness is important, but so is standing up for yourself. True love respects both partners, not just one. Edit. For those who asked, I'm now with someone who appreciates my kindness without taking advantage of it. Story 121. If I could go back, I'd tell myself not to ignore how I felt in the quiet moments. I was in a relationship where, on the surface, everything seemed fine. We got along well, and there weren't any big issues, but whenever we were just sitting together, I'd feel this weird emptiness. I kept brushing it off, telling myself that maybe it was just my mood or stress. Eventually, I realized it was because I wasn't truly happy, and I was ignoring it to avoid facing the reality. Now I know that if you're feeling empty when you're with someone, it's worth looking into why. Story 122. I'd remind myself that someone who loves you will never make you question your worth. My ex had a habit of comparing me to others. Why can't you be more ambitious like him? Or, she would never act like that. I started feeling like I wasn't enough, constantly trying to be someone I wasn't to meet his standards. It wore me down over time. Looking back, I'd tell myself that love should build you up, not tear you down. You deserve someone who loves you exactly as you are, without comparisons. Story 123. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that shared humor is more important than I thought. I was in a relationship where we just didn't laugh much together. We had the same goals and values, but there was something missing. Whenever I'd make a joke or try to lighten the mood, it would fall flat. Over time, I felt like I was missing a part of myself, like I had to hide my sense of humor. Now, I know that laughter and shared joy are huge in a relationship. If you can't laugh together, it's hard to feel fully understood. Edit. And yes, I eventually found someone who gets my humor, and it's made such a difference. Story 124. I tell myself that it's okay to want reassurance. I dated someone who thought expressing feelings or asking for reassurance was clingy, and would get annoyed anytime I tried to talk about my insecurities. I ended up bottling everything up, trying to appear chill and unaffected, but it just made me feel more alone. Now, I realize that needing reassurance doesn't make you needy, it makes you human. The right person will understand that and won't make you feel bad for needing support. Story 125. If I could go back, I'd remind myself that no one's too busy to make time if they care. My ex was constantly too busy for me. Too busy to call, too busy to hang out, even too busy to text back. I kept making excuses for him, telling myself he had a lot going on, but eventually I saw that if he really wanted to, he would have made time. Looking back, I know that a person who truly cares will always find time for you. You deserve someone who prioritizes you, not just squeezes you in. Edit. For everyone wondering, yes, I'm with someone now who makes me feel like a priority. Story 126. I'd go back and tell myself that love doesn't mean sacrificing your identity. I dated a guy who subtly discouraged my interests. He'd say my hobbies were silly or a waste of time, and I ended up dropping them just to keep him happy. But over time, I felt like I'd lost pieces of myself and was just going through the motions of being someone else. Now, I know that love should support who you are, not chip away at it. Don't give up your passions just to fit into someone else's life. Story 127. If I could go back, I'd remind myself that some people just want attention, not a real relationship. My ex was great at making me feel special when we were together, but I started to notice he was like that with everyone. He was flirty, constantly texting other people, and seemed more interested in how many people liked him than in having a solid connection with anyone. I eventually learned that it wasn't personal. He just wanted the thrill of attention. Now, I know that a real relationship is about commitment, not how popular they can feel. Edit. And yes, he's still chasing attention, but I'm much happier without it. Story 128. I tell myself that love isn't about keeping score. My ex would keep track of everything he did for me, and would always bring it up in arguments like, I did this for you, so now you owe me. It felt like I was always in debt to him, even for simple things, and I hated that everything had to be balanced like a ledger. Now, I know that true love doesn't keep score. Acts of kindness shouldn't come with strings attached, and you shouldn't feel like you owe each other constantly. Story 129. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that how someone talks about their exes says a lot. My ex used to badmouth all his past girlfriends, calling them crazy or toxic, and I figured they must have been awful. But over time, I realized he had a lot of issues himself, and probably played a big role in those situations. It made me question what he'd say about me if things ended. Now, I know that people who blame everyone else rarely take responsibility. If someone can't speak respectfully about their past, it's a red flag. Edit. Yes, he did end up talking badly about me too after we split. Lesson learned. Story 130. I tell myself that rushing a relationship won't make it any stronger. I dated someone who wanted to move in together within a few months, talked about marriage right away, and just moved at a pace that made my head spin. I went along with it, thinking that faster meant we were just meant to be. But after a while, I felt trapped, like we skipped the steps of really getting to know each other. Looking back, I know that taking time to build a foundation is key. Rushing only makes things unstable, no matter how exciting it feels. Edit. And yes, I'm now with someone who's happy to take things slow, and it's the healthiest relationship I've had. Story 131. If I could go back, I'd tell myself not to let someone make me feel ashamed of my emotions. My ex was always telling me I was too sensitive or overreacting anytime I expressed how I felt. I started to believe him and kept a lot of my feelings bottled up because I didn't want to seem unreasonable. Eventually, I felt like I couldn't open up at all without being judged. Looking back, I know that love should make you feel safe to express yourself, not ashamed. The right person will respect your feelings, even if they don't fully understand them. Story 132. I'd remind myself that compromise should go both ways. I was with someone who expected me to adapt to their life completely, where they lived, their friends, even their schedule. I rearranged my whole life around them, thinking that's just what love required. But every time I asked for a little compromise from their side, they'd say I was being demanding. Now, I know that a relationship is about meeting each other halfway. If one person is doing all the bending, it's not a real partnership. Story 133. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that shared values matter more than shared interests. I dated a guy who loved all the same music, movies, and hobbies I did, and I thought we were perfect. But when it came to big things, our morals, our goals, our views on family, we were on totally different pages. I ignored it for as long as I could, thinking our fun times would make up for it, but eventually, the differences were just too big to ignore. Now, I know that core values are what really hold a relationship together, more than any shared interests. Edit. And yes, I've since met someone who's aligned with my values, and it's a completely different experience. Story 134. I tell myself not to get stuck in the cycle of breaking up and getting back together. My ex and I had this on-again, off-again thing for years, and each time we'd get back together, I'd convince myself it would be different. But it never was. We'd go back to the same arguments, the same issues, and each time it ended, I felt even more drained. Looking back, I know that if you keep repeating the same pattern, it's time to let go. Breaking the cycle was hard, but it was the best thing I did for myself. Story 135. If I could go back, I'd remind myself that feeling lonely in a relationship is worse than being alone. I was with someone who was emotionally unavailable, and I felt like I was always reaching out but never truly connecting. I'd sit next to him, but it felt like we were miles apart. I stayed because I thought any relationship was better than none, but it only made me feel emptier. Now, I know that being alone is better than being with someone who makes you feel invisible. You deserve someone who actually sees you. Edit. For everyone asking, yes, I eventually left and took some time alone. It was a game changer. Story 136. I tell myself that love isn't about fixing someone's past. My ex had a lot of trauma from previous relationships, and I thought if I could just love him enough, I'd heal his wounds. I put all my energy into making him feel safe, only to realize that he wasn't interested in working on himself. I was exhausted, trying to be the perfect partner, to compensate for everything he'd been through. Looking back, I know that healing is something each person has to do on their own. You can support someone, but you can't fix them. Story 137. If I could go back, I'd remind myself that trust is earned, not forced. I dated someone who was very private about his phone, his social media, even little details about his life. I wanted to trust him, so I told myself it didn't matter. But over time, the secrecy made me anxious, and I realized I didn't know as much about him as I thought. Now, I know that true trust grows from openness. If someone keeps too many parts of their life hidden, it's okay to ask questions. Edit. And yes, I eventually found out he wasn't being honest. Trust your instincts. Story 138. I tell myself that love bombing is a red flag, not a compliment. My ex swept me off my feet with gifts, Constant attention and grand declarations of love within weeks of meeting. I thought I'd found the one, but once he had me hooked, everything changed. The attention faded, and I was left feeling confused and hurt. It was a high-speed relationship that came crashing down just as fast. Looking back, I know that real love doesn't rush like that. Take your time to really get to know someone. It's worth it. Story 139. If I could go back, I'd remind myself that boundaries are a sign of respect, not distance. I dated a guy who didn't believe in boundaries and thought that because we were together, we had to share everything and do everything together. It sounded romantic at first, but over time, I felt smothered. I needed space, but anytime I tried to set limits, he'd accuse me of being cold or distant. Now, I know that boundaries actually strengthen a relationship. They're there to protect both people, not push them apart. Edit. Yes, setting boundaries was hard, but I found someone who respects them now, and it feels amazing. Story 140. I tell myself that a relationship should enhance your life, not complicate it. My ex was constantly creating drama. Arguments, jealousy, even fights over small things like who I followed on social media. I thought it was just part of being passionate, but after a while, I realized that I was exhausted. My life felt chaotic because of the constant issues. Looking back, I know that love should bring peace, not chaos. You deserve a partner who makes life easier, not harder. Edit. For anyone going through this, remember, real love doesn't make you feel like you're constantly putting out fires. Story 141. If I could go back, I'd tell myself not to put someone else's dreams above my own. I was with someone who had big plans, moving to a new city, starting a business, traveling, and I let myself get swept up in their vision. I put aside my own goals and followed along, thinking it was romantic. But as time went on, I realized I was losing sight of what I actually wanted for myself. Now, I know that in a healthy relationship, both people's dreams should be respected and pursued. It's okay to support each other, but don't lose yourself in someone else's life. Story 142. I'd remind myself that being with someone who's a work in progress isn't always worth it. I dated a guy who admitted he was still figuring himself out, and I thought it would be exciting to be there as he grew. But in reality, he used his work in progress status as an excuse for everything, avoiding commitment, bailing on plans, and dodging tough conversations. I realized I was waiting for someone to become a partner he never intended to be. Looking back, I tell myself that people need to be ready for a relationship, not just experimenting with one. Story 143. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that love isn't about constant reassurance. My ex always needed to be told how much I cared, that I wasn't going anywhere, and that he was the only one for me. At first, I thought it was sweet, but after a while it became exhausting. No matter how much I reassured him, it was never enough. Now I know that real love comes with a sense of security. If someone needs endless reassurance, it might be their own insecurities talking, not love. Edit. And yes, I did try talking to him about it, but it didn't change. It was a tough lesson. Story 144. I tell myself not to ignore early signs of possessiveness. My ex would get upset whenever I spent time with friends or family without him, and he'd constantly question who I was texting. I thought it was just because he cared, but it quickly turned into a need to control every part of my life. I ended up distancing myself from my loved ones just to keep him happy. Looking back, I know that love is about trust, not possession. If someone can't handle you having a life outside of them, it's a red flag. Story 145. If I could go back, I'd remind myself that self-worth isn't defined by a relationship. I used to think that having a partner was the ultimate validation, so I stayed in a relationship that wasn't right for me because I thought being with someone was better than being alone. I relied on the relationship to make me feel valuable, even when it made me unhappy. Now, I know that true self-worth comes from within. Being single isn't a failure, and you don't need a relationship to feel complete. Edit. Yes, I took time alone after that relationship, and it was honestly the best thing for me. Story 146. I tell myself that sometimes people can love you but still not be good for you. I dated someone who cared deeply for me, but he had a lot of unresolved issues that impacted our relationship. His insecurities, jealousy, and lack of trust ended up weighing on us both. I thought that because he loved me, we could work through anything, but love alone wasn't enough to make it healthy. Now, I know that love is important, but so is stability and emotional maturity. Sometimes, you have to let go of someone, even if they love you, for your own well-being. Story 147. If I could go back, I'd tell myself not to overlook little lies. My ex would tell these white lies, like saying he was home when he was out with friends, or downplaying interactions with other people. I ignored it, thinking it was harmless, but those small lies piled up over time, and I found myself questioning everything he said. It created an atmosphere of distrust that ultimately broke us apart. Now, I know that honesty, even about the small things, is crucial. Little lies can build up and cause as much damage as big ones. Edit. And yes, in the end, those little lies did reveal bigger issues. Trust is everything. Story 148. I tell myself that love should feel safe, not like a test. My ex would constantly test my loyalty by setting up situations to see how I'd react. He'd make up stories to see if I'd get jealous, or deliberately ignore me to see if I'd come running. I felt like I was always being evaluated, and it made me anxious and insecure. Now, I know that real love doesn't test you, it trusts you. A relationship should bring peace, not feel like an endless audition. Story 149. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that relationships shouldn't require you to change who you are. I dated someone who always made suggestions on how I could improve, how I should dress, who I should hang out with, even my choice of career. I thought I was just becoming a better person, but in reality, I was losing myself. Now, I know that the right person will accept you as you are. Love doesn't ask you to change your core to fit someone else's ideals. Edit. Yes, I eventually found someone who loves me for who I am, and it's a world of difference. Story 150. I tell myself that rushing physical intimacy doesn't build a lasting bond. My ex pushed us to move fast physically, and I went along with it because I thought it would make our relationship stronger. But in reality, we skipped building an emotional foundation, and when the physical spark faded, there wasn't much left between us. Looking back, I know that a strong relationship needs more than just physical chemistry. Building a real connection takes time. Edit. And yes, I've learned to take things slow now. It's been worth it for the deeper connection. Story 151. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that love isn't supposed to be complicated. I was with someone who always made things feel like a struggle. Every little disagreement became a huge issue, every decision a negotiation. I thought that meant we were working hard for our relationship, but in reality, it was just exhausting. Now, I know that while relationships take effort, they shouldn't feel like constant work. Love can be simple and straightforward, and it's okay to want that. Story 152. I'd remind myself that being needed isn't the same as being loved. My ex was constantly going through crises, and I felt like I had to be there for him all the time. I thought it was love, but I was really just his emotional crutch. Anytime I needed support, though, he was nowhere to be found. Looking back, I learned that love is mutual support. If someone only takes and never gives, it's not real love. It's dependency. Story 153. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that a relationship shouldn't feel like a competition. My ex was constantly comparing us. Who made more money? Who had more friends? Who was more successful? I felt like I was always trying to catch up, instead of just enjoying our time together. It got to a point where I felt more like a rival than a partner. Now, I know that a true partnership lifts both people up. If you're constantly competing, it's not a relationship, it's a game. Edit. Yes, I'm now with someone who cheers for my wins, and I do the same for them. It's a huge relief. Story 154. I tell myself that love should be consistent, not full of highs and lows. I was in a relationship that was incredibly intense one day and cold the next. It felt like we were either on top of the world or barely speaking. I thought the passion made it worth it, but it just left me feeling emotionally drained and confused. Now, I know that real love is steady. It's the everyday, consistent care that builds trust, not wild ups and downs. Story 155. If I could go back, I'd remind myself that love shouldn't feel like constantly trying to prove myself. My ex was always setting expectations, and I'd bend over backward to meet them, thinking that would finally make them happy. But no matter what I did, there was always something more I should be doing. Now, I know that love doesn't require constant validation. The right person won't make you feel like you're always falling short. Edit. For those asking, yes, I finally stopped trying to meet impossible expectations and found someone who values me as I am. Story 156. I tell myself that if someone can't apologize, it's a problem. My ex would never admit to being wrong, even for little things. He'd rather turn the blame around or pretend nothing happened than say sorry. I found myself apologizing just to keep the peace, but it felt like I was taking the blame for things I didn't even do. Now, I know that humility and accountability are essential in a relationship. Both people need to own their mistakes for it to work. Story 157. If I could go back, I'd tell myself not to confuse intense attraction with real love. I was in a relationship where the chemistry was off the charts, and I mistook that intensity for something deep. We'd have these passionate moments but then struggle to connect on an emotional level. Eventually, I realized that physical attraction alone couldn't sustain us. Now, I know that a lasting connection needs more than just attraction. Emotional compatibility matters just as much, if not more. Edit. And yes, I found someone later who I connect with on all levels. It's a whole different experience. Story 158. I'd remind myself that shared values mean more than shared interests. My ex and I bonded over music, travel, and movies, and it felt perfect at first. But when it came to big life decisions, like where to live, how to handle finances, even views on family, we were on completely different pages. I kept hoping our shared interest would bridge that gap, but it didn't. Now, I know that a relationship needs a foundation in values and goals. It's what makes the bigger picture work. Story 159. If I could go back, I'd tell myself that a good partner will want to be there for the small moments too. My ex was great at showing up for big events but rarely made an effort on regular days. Birthdays, holidays, yes, he was amazing. But day to day, I often felt like an afterthought. I realized I wanted someone who cared about the little things, not just the highlights. Now, I know that love is shown in the everyday, not just the special occasions. Small acts mean a lot. Edit. And yes, I eventually found someone who shows up consistently. It's a totally different kind of security. Story 160. I tell myself not to let someone's potential keep me stuck. I dated someone who had dreams and ideas, but never took action on any of them. I kept holding on, thinking he'd eventually get his life together, but he never did. I realized I was in love with the idea of who he could be, not who he actually was. Looking back, I know that you have to accept people as they are, not as you hope they'll become. Potential alone isn't enough to keep a relationship strong.